نرحب جميعا بالاستاذ طارق رمضان.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay, I'm going to talk about after the other Arab Spring, the ethical reference, and are we talking about the relationship between Islam and governance and the relationship between the ethical reference? Are we talking about an ethical reference or an alternative project? It's a session and we have many reference in English and a discussion from within, and we go ahead with this, trying to be quite focused on some of the points that I want to make. As an introduction, when it comes to Islam and governance, I think that the first problem that we have when it comes to governance and the way we deal with managing power, al-hukuma, al-sulta, all these dimensions that we have in mustalahat, we have a problem with the concept of governance. Because very often what we think and the way we reduce governance is the way we manage the state and we deal with the power and the authority of the state. And we have lots of things, and even in all what is done today in the contemporary research and books that we may have, very often when we speak about the hukm al-rashid, what we are talking about is what we are dealing, the way we are dealing with governance. And what I want to do today is, especially in the light of what is happening in Egypt or in Tunisia, is to complexify, to get a better understanding, or at least to have the multiple dimensions of what we talk about. And especially from an Islamic viewpoint, because very often when we come is in the Islamic discussion or the discussion among Muslim scholars and Muslim thinkers, the way we deal is between the tradition, and we want to go beyond the ahkam al-sultaniyya and all what is said about this and to come to a contemporary understanding. But from the traditional to the modern or to the contemporary, there is something which is sometimes the simplification of what is the Islamic reference. Even when we speak from, and we go from الدولة الإسلامية, the Islamic state, to الدولة المدنية, which is the civil state, that مرجعية إسلامية with Islamic reference. What do we mean in ethical terms and when it comes to assessing what governance means? Second point that I want to make is, when we speak about good governance, it's not enough. And as you can see, all the discussions that we had in Egypt, for example, about the discussion, are we talking about Sharia as the reference or the principles of Sharia? And in fact, the point is that what is discussed here between the Salafi or the Salafiyun and the Islamiyun or the Ikhwan or even here as the Nahda is the very understanding of Sharia. We are referring to the same concept, we don't have the same understanding of what Sharia is. So when the people are saying the principles of Sharia, it could be that the principles of Sharia are coming from something which is outside the very essence of what we think is taken from the scriptural sources, but is right in Islamic terms, even though it's coming from other civilizations, other thinkers, other contributions. And when we go from principles, from Sharia to principles, we need to open up the very understanding of Sharia and the very understanding of what we are talking about. So what we are talking about when we say al-hukm al-rashid, for example, is good governance, and good governance is principled governance. It's not only something which is dealing with a legal framework, it is the way we deal with the legal framework and we question the ethical objectives and the ends and the goals of the state. So to speak about or to qualify the state is very far from giving us a clear answer as to what we are talking about. And the last point is what is important for us. And I would say in what is happening now, in Tunisia or in Egypt, in other societies, is in which way the Islamic references and the Islamic principles and the Islamic ethics, al-akhlaq al-Islamiyya, the way we understand them, should play a role and help us to go to something which is a more complex and a deeper understanding of what we are talking about when we come to the governance and the relationship between governance and the principles or the Islamic principles. Let me start just, as it is a very short talk, just to raise some points that I think we have to talk about in theoretical terms, but in very practical terms. Because what we heard right now, for example, something which is freedom of expression. It's quite clear that in every society, freedom of expression has not only to do with the legal framework, it has to do with the cultural reference and the collective psychology. And you cannot just come and say this is free. Anyone who is living in Europe, is not going to do with the Jewish experience what could be said about others. Why? Because it's deeply rooted in the European conscience. You cannot laugh at the suffering of Jews. First, it is silly. Second, it cannot be understood. Third, it shouldn't be done. Not because it's against the law, because it's legal, you can do it. But what sometimes is legal, it deeply could be silly and counter to our... Everything is falling here. A little micro conspiracy.
Transition value.
I don't know, it's not. Okay. Can you hear me? Now? Now it's okay. Okay. We'll try my best. Now, when it comes to this, let me start with talking about governance and the multiple dimensions of what I'm referring to when I speak about government. First, it's quite clear, we are talking about the state, we are talking about managing the state and the authority of the state with any society. And in a Muslim majority country, it's important to come to this because the democratic transition, as it is the topic of our discussion here, is something that we have to take very seriously because they are upstream principles and they are downstream principles that we have to tackle in a very consistent way. Now, when we speak about governance, and this is something which is very, very important in the transitory period in Egypt and in Tunisia, but not only. In Libya it's the same, in Jordan today it's the same, in Bahrain it's problematic, in Syria you can see how much this is now problematic as to the future of the country, but we have to be very, very clear on what we are talking about when we deal with the civil society. Governance has to do with civil society and managing power and authority within the civil society and the non-state institution. And the last thing which I would say it's important in our discussion within the society but also with the West is the cultural side of governance. Today, there is no deep understanding of what a good governance is for a specific society if we sideline and we don't talk about the cultural dimension. Governance has to do with the cultural dimension. It's deep, it's profound, it's the unsaid, it's the unworded dimension, but it's very important when it comes to sensitivities, to the values. Here we're not talking about is it legal or not. It's the psychology, it's the culture, it's history, it's memories. And any society which is serious about this, and especially when it comes to Muslim majority countries today, in the relationship with the West, sometimes the reaction as being defensive towards the West makes the mindset being defensive and protective as to the culture. How can we, in the name of a good governance, be principled, faithful to our principles, and at the same time open to the other, open to a discussion? And it's not only outside. Anyone now in this society who's looking at the secularists as only agents coming from the West are wrong. You have Tunisia Tunisian secularies that are part of this society, they are part of the discussion. So the cultural dimension here is to make sure that we are not misled in our domestic national discussion. How could they be critical within without being put outside the common narrative? And the common narrative is the cultural side of the nation. It might be that the problem is not only a problem of dealing with the state, but dealing with the nation. And anyone who is now living in the West knows that. The Muslim Westerns, for example, they don't have a problem with the state. They have a problem with the concept of nation. You can today have an American passport, a French passport, a Swiss passport, and you are a Western citizen as to the state and perceived as alien to the common narrative. So you are a foreign citizen. New concept, new reality. It's not legal, but it's effective. And this is also important in Tunisia now, when some of the people are putting some of the fellow citizens outside the cultural dimension. You are no longer representing us. But who is this us and who are you talking about? It has to do with governance. It has to do with good governance. It has to do with the authority. Because the authority is not only the power of the law, the power of the state, it's the power of terminology, it's the power of belonging, it's the power of us. Who is defining this us today? And it's a very deep challenge when you see what is happening in Egypt now and what could happen here when we heard some of the statements of people putting people outside and putting themselves with it by saying, we are the nation and you are no longer.